Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and as you could probably tell by the sound of my voice, I'm still recovering from my sickness, but I figured I would get back to making videos, especially because Divine Mysteries is right around the corner, and I want to get as much about at least War of Immortals out before that book comes out, as I'm super excited for that book. And funny enough, that book is super relevant to today's video. So if you don't want to miss out on anything that comes out from that book, because I tend to get the books like a week earlier, so I do recommend subscribing to the channel. Now that that plug's out of the way, let's talk about the Vindicators. So the Vindicator is a much awaited class archetype, though many would have preferred it to be a class unto itself. And that's because the Vindicator was kind of inspired by the Inquisitor from Pathfinder 1st Edition. If you're unfamiliar with the Inquisitor from Pathfinder 1st Edition, I wouldn't blame you. It's a very fun class. It had some unique abilities, some kind of focus spells of its own to give context for 2E players, and focus on teamwork feats and divine retribution, all kinds of really cool stuff. It was a class that, for how 2nd edition is going, isn't necessarily Paizo's direction, but they figured that the Ranger did a lot of the things that the Inquisitor did, only, rather than rehashing Ranger, we're just getting a class archetype. And if you're unfamiliar with the concept of class archetypes are archetypes that you select at level 1 that changes completely how your class plays. And then at level 2, you must pick up its dedication feat. So it is a little bit of an investment, but it is an interesting way that we can change up how a class plays. And by giving that level 2 feat investment, it can get a little bit more power than a standard subclass for these classes normally would. So for the Vindicator, for instance, we are getting a Ranger that's much more spell focused, and to a very strong degree. I would say a Ranger is as good as a spellcaster in spellcasting ability for a large part of the game. They don't have the same weight, and they definitely don't get spell slots, but with the use of their warden spells or their newly shaped warden spells that come from the domains of the various gods, we can get a very fun class. I really, really like how the Vindicator has been set up, but this is not a replacement of Inquisitor. This is a whole new thing. So if you're coming into Vindicator thinking, oh, this is just Inquisitor, it really isn't. That's not what I would expect. What I would expect is, if you want to play a Ranger that's much more spell focused, this is the class archetype to pick. So how does Vindicator change how you play a Ranger? Well, first of all, rather than being trained in nature, we are trained in religion. Also, you must select a god because we become trained in our god's favored weapon. And if that weapon is a simple weapon, then we gain the Deadly Simplicity feat, increasing the damage die by 1 step up to a D12. And if our deity's weapon happens to be advanced for whatever reason, our proficiency with that weapon and that weapon alone increases at the same rate as our martial weapon proficiencies, which is really cool. And it gives us a very wide amount of weapons we can possibly use with the Ranger, which I am very appreciative of. It's very cool. Another interesting thing about this particular class archetype is whatever sanctification our deity has, we get as well. So we could be neutral, or we could be a holy or unholy Ranger, which is very cool. And this does apply to some of the features of the class, which I think is really good. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, but when we select either the Domain Initiate or Advanced Domain feats, which we do get access to through this class, I'll talk about that here in a moment, we treat those as warden spells for all intents and purposes, which is really nice that it ties into some of our other features and may play a factor later in Paizo's development, where we might get more features that directly tie into warden spells. So I did mention the additional feats. We do get more than just Domain Initiate and Advanced Domain, though they're both here on this list. We also get the Instructive Strike from Thaumaturge, pretty cool. We get Ongoing Investigation and Thorough Research from Investigator. So this is a much more investigative, magic-y kind of Ranger, and I'm all here for. I think it's really cool. I think it's sick being an actual like servant of God hunting down the heretics. I think that's really interesting and can make for some very interesting styles of characters. And of course, being a ranger class archetype, we get access to a new edge that we must take, and we can only take this if we are a Vindicator. And it's called Vindicators Edge. It's a little on the nose, but it gets the job done. Now, this edge, unlike the other ones that either help you with your hunting capabilities or your martial combat abilities, this one helps you with your spell casting abilities, giving you a +1 spell attack bonus that is a status bonus, and enemies that are your hunted prey. And technically, you only get these bonuses against your hunted prey. That's pretty par for the course for Hunter's Edges, but I figured I'd mention. But enemies that you are hunting currently also get a -1 to their saves against your divine spells, which it's any divine spells, not just our warden spells, which is very interesting. So if we do any multi-class archetyping with our builds, we pick up a multi-class that gives us spell slots that give us divine spells, we're pretty much a spellcaster. The only difference between a Vindicator and a spellcaster, at least up through level 7, is we have to hunt prey to get the same bonuses. So we hit the same as a spellcaster because, as a ranger, we get either strength or dex as our key ability score for our class, and spellcasters will get their spellcasting one, meaning there would be a 1-point difference. But when we're hunting our prey, thanks to Vindicator's Edge, we make up that difference both for spell attack rolls and for any spell saves, meaning that the Vindicator is legitimately as good at spellcasting as spellcasters, sans the fact that they don't get spells or cantrips. They can only do it, at least bare minimum, with our warden spells. Now, that's not a huge, it's like, oh no, Ranger's not now a better spellcaster than other spellcasters. You still would have to multi-class archetype, and because we are taking a class archetype, we can't select that multi-class at the very least until level 4, and we wouldn't even get anything beyond a cantrip until level 6. Spellcasters are going to be pretty okay, having much higher level slots and everything than us. But going as far down multi-class archetypes as we could get at least up to Master Proficiency, which is really solid, actually. I think the Vindicator opens so many doors up to Ranger, and I absolutely love this. It gives me so many cool ideas for a Ranger. Now, some of our other class features do change as well. Trackless Journey actually gives us the option now to choose urban rather than a natural terrain, though we do need to select this when we pick it up, so we can either be urban or natural terrain, but not both. This does allow you to be more flexible in case your campaign is much more wilderness-based, but I do think urban is a very strong choice because so many campaigns take place in or around cities. It can only be useful, in my opinion. Is it better than natural terrains? I don't know, but it could be, depending on your campaign. And as well, of course, since we have a new edge, we get a new increased benefit with Masterful Hunter, which allows us to get Vindication. Vindication just improves our general buff from Vindicator's Edge from +2 and from +1 and -1 to +2 and -2. So we get to keep up with the spellcasters yet again, because at the end game, spellcasters will have the ability to have a little bit higher of their spellcasting than we could feasibly get with our wisdom. But thanks to this bonus, again, we're going to be able to keep up and maybe surpass depending on players' builds. Oh, and I totally forgot to mention, but in the Vindicator's Edge, we also gain access to a new focus spell, a warden spell that we get at level 1. So not only by selecting this class archetype do we get trained proficiency in maybe some unique weapon, which, by the way, we also get a feat with Deadly Simplicity that we don't have to pick up ourselves, leaving our level 1 slot open for probably Domain Initiate, but we also get a focus spell at level 1. I gotta say, Vindicator is probably my favorite class archetype up to date, at the very least. And speaking on Vindicator's Mark, it's really good. Now, as a focus spell, and let's go ahead and pull it up here. As a focus spell, it is 2 actions, which does suck considering it does cost us a resource, and many other focus spells are going to be just a 1-pointer. But this one does make sense because it gives us a lot of benefits. First of all, it essentially gives us gravity weapon in a different form. Now, we do need to make a spell attack against an enemy, and it does have to hit, which is kind of bad, but there's many ways to reduce an enemy's AC. And of course, if we are stealthing before a combat, it's a lot easier to get this off because the enemy will be typically off guard. But once we hit, the enemy takes 2d4 spirit damage, and then all of our attacks, not just our deity's favorite weapon, get essentially the benefits of gravity weapon. It is a +2 to all of our weapon attacks. Now, it kind of sucks that it doesn't apply to any spells we might get as well, but there's actually another focus spell for that a little bit later, so stay tuned. Now, in addition to the damage, we also put a Nimbus on the enemy. This Nimbus is something that only we can see, so even if the creature changes shape or anything like that, they are still perceptible to us. And more importantly, if they go invisible, we only treat them as concealed rather than unnoticed, making them a lot easier to hit. And to top all of this off, if we successfully strike the enemy, we can dismiss the spell, and the enemy takes an immediate 2d6 spirit damage, which is really good because that means if the enemy is getting pretty low, we're not confident that we're going to be able to hit the enemy again before one of our allies slays the enemy, but we can remove the spell and deal some decent damage to the enemy, allowing our ally to secure the kill for us. Pretty solid. And this focus spell heightens like many others, though not every spell rank. This is every odd spell rank, so at 1st, 3rd, 5th, 7th, and 9th, we get to add a little bit more damage. Our initial spell damage does an additional 2d4 damage, which is very solid, and the extra damage to our weapon attacks increases by 1 every time it's heightened, and every time we dismiss the spell, its damage is heightened by an additional d6 as well. So this has pretty decent scaling. My only complaint would be this is all spirit damage, and of course, enemies that don't take spirit damage, this is not going to be helpful for at all. Even if the enemy is resistant or even immune to the additional spirit damage we deal, the extra weapon damage makes this as good as using gravity weapon, with the exception that, of course, there's a little bit of an extra action economy and the initial damage wouldn't do anything. So gravity weapon would still be better in that regard. And of course, it's good not to completely make gravity weapon worthless. But I will say that this is still a really good one to have, especially as a Vindicator, and especially because no matter what, we don't have to, we can get gravity weapon. We can get gravity weapon because we get Vindicator's Mark just by being a Vindicator. No additional feat costs. So again, a very solid option. So all these 15 or so minutes that I've been talking about in the video, that's all just for selecting the Vindicator. That's not even talking about the various feats. So let's go ahead and do that. So with the dedication, we do get a non-combat benefit, which I know a lot of people hate, but we got so many great benefits at level 1. I'm not too upset about it, and it's really cool. So as a Vindicator, we can use religion rather than diplomacy to coerce, gather information, make an impression, or make a request from an NPC typically, as long as the city or town that we're in has a church that we currently belong to. It does mean that we don't really get benefit from this if we pick a very weird or off-kilter kind of god, but many major cities, like mega cities, do have a church of all gods. So technically, you can use this in any of the major cities like Absalom. And if the target is either a member of our church or a worshiper of our deity, we can get a +2 circumstance bonus to these checks, or if there are hunted prey, which really makes the rest of this kind of pointless because we can mark anyone as our hunted prey. It's just a concentration action. It doesn't do anything. So literally, before we go up and talk to any NPC, we can just hunt them and get this benefit. So it doesn't matter if they're a worshiper or not. We actually technically can always get this benefit. It's the same thing as the wit edge. So very interesting that they decided to make that difference here, but the theming works at the very least. And it's really good. It does mean that our character, without the need of diplomacy, as long as we're in the appropriate cities, can be really good at gathering information and doing face tasks for the party, which I think is very good. And it does make this a slightly more rounded out class, as Ranger tends to be only good at killing things or tracking things. So I do really like this dedication feat, even if it doesn't add to our combat ability. Now, we do have a little bit of a jump in at level 6. We get our next class archetype, that feat that we can select, or of course, we can always just pick our other ranger feats, but we get Interrogate. Now, Interrogate is another really good face-based option because as an action, we can ask a question to an enemy. We make an intimidation against the enemy's will DC, and based on the level of success, we can just get information out of them. If we crit succeed this check, the enemy has to answer our question. They can't refuse to answer. And if they try to lie to us, or for any other perception checks we might make, we get a +4 circumstance bonus to those checks. And with success, relatively the same thing, only the bonus is a little bit smaller. If we fail, though, the enemy can just refuse to answer our question and they become unfriendly to us if they weren't already. And if we crit fail, we can't interrogate them again and they become hostile to us. So this is a little bit of a saber suck kind of feat. If we fail, the enemy or the NPC might not like us, but if we're using this to interrogate an NPC, this can be a really good way to get information out of an NPC. Really good for gathering information, especially if you manage to capture one of your foes in a conflict, which does happen a lot in campaigns, is something I notice. So I would say Interrogate is really good. Is it worth a 6th level feat, though? I don't think so. I would have made this a level 4 feat, if anything. It is really good, and especially in some kind of campaigns, but I do feel like a major part of the player base isn't going to make the most use out of this, especially in a feat that competes with something like reactive strike. So Interrogate is, I think, a really good feat, especially for your purposes, and in some campaigns can be invaluable, but I don't think it should have been a level 6 feat. At minimum, this should have been a level 4 feat. I think it would have done much better there. Speaking on Reactive Strike, we actually get a different version of Reactive Strike, essentially with Disrupt Magic. This is a really cool reaction because as long as an enemy is within our reach or within the first range increments of a ranged weapon we're using, we can use this reaction to shoot them when they attempt to cast a spell. And as long as the strike is just successful, this will disrupt the action, which is absolutely insane. And the best part is we don't even have to be hunting this current enemy to get the benefit. Though this does have a major downside of requiring our deity's favorite weapon. There's not many deities that have good ranged weapons by my account. So this can be a little rough, though there is a recent orc god that has been announced, or well, it has been revealed in one of the new adventure paths that uses a really cool gun. So this could be very, very interesting. And considering it can disrupt the action on just a successful strike rather than a crit strike, does make this better at disrupting spell actions than even a fighter with reactive strike. Though granted, a fighter has a good chance of critting a squishy spellcaster, but most there's a good number of enemies in the game that use spells that are not necessarily squishy. So I do think disrupt opposed magic is actually really, really good and definitely worth a pickup. Now, at level 10, we get Vindicator's Judgment. This gives us access to another Warden spell, giving us another focus point, and Vindicator's Judgment is a really cool focus spell. Now, this is a one-action focus spell, unlike Vindicator's Mark, and can be used on an enemy within 60 feet, but they do have to be our hunted prey. We pronounce a terrible judgment upon the enemy for their sacrilege or heresy, who knows, and make them weak to our strikes. The enemy needs to make a fortitude saving throw against our spell DC, which, by the way, I should mention at this point, our spell DC does eventually get up to master proficiency with Masterful Hunter. So sure, our proficiencies for spellcasting are not as quick as spellcasters, even being so much, I think it's like 13 and then 17 when spellcasters get their spell proficiency at level 7 and then master, I think at 15. I'm not sure. Not super relevant for the... I say that and it's not relevant for the video, but someone's going to make a fit about it. So let me check real quick. Indeed, I was correct. It is level 15 for most spellcasters. So even at endgame, we are just a couple levels off, and then they get legendary at level 19, which is 2 levels beyond that. So like I said, for a good majority of the game, we're tied up with spellcasters. Anyway, back to the focus spell. Vindicator's Judgment, like Vindicator's Mark, lasts for a minute, and the enemy is weak based on the level of failure of the fortitude save. If they crit succeed, nothing happens. If they succeed, the target has a weakness 5 to our strikes or any of our divine spells until the end of the next turn. Not so good, and for a focus spell just to add 5 extra damage, that's really bad. So I wouldn't use Vindicator's Judgment if you don't know the enemy's fortitude DC, or you haven't done anything to reduce its DC. Actually, or if it doesn't have a low fort DC and you haven't done anything to remove it, then yeah, it's not a really good focus spell. But if it does have a low fortitude save, it's really good because if they fail, they just get that 5 weakness for the full minute, increasing our damage again. And considering that this is untyped, this is weakness, essentially, this stacks with Vindicator's Mark because we will be doing extra damage and the enemy will be taking extra damage from our strikes. But something I think even more important than that is this also applies to any divine spells we do. Many divine spells are based on a basic saving throw. So if we use a spell and the enemy succeeds, typically they still take some damage, meaning they're going to take extra damage from our spells, which is really good. And if the enemy ever crit fails, they are in for a world of hurt because they are considered off guard to our first spell attack or strike made against it every round. So every round, the first strike or spell attack we make against them, they are considered off guard, meaning our damage potential is even higher. Now, it's only 5 damage for a 5th rank spell. Not super great, but extra damage is extra damage, right? And if the enemy just has a really bad fortitude saving throw, this is honestly better damage-wise than Vindicator's Mark. But I will say when it goes up every odd spell rank. So at 7th and 9th, it goes up to 10 and then 15. And at 7th spell rank, which is when we are getting to level 13, it does 10 extra damage whenever we hit the enemy. That's really, really good, especially at 7th spell rank. And at 9th spell rank, 15 damage is pretty good too. So I would say Vindicator's Judgment is really good. I would probably not select it until level 14 maybe, or maybe level 12, so that when you level up to 13, you get that better benefit. And of course, this is very situational. You want to use it against enemies that are not super great at fortitude DCs, because on success, we're using a focus point to only gain 5, maybe 10 damage, which is just not worth the focus point. We're better off holding off on using our Vindicator's Mark for another enemy in a fight. So Vindicator's Judgment is good, potentially, if the enemy doesn't have great fortitude saves, and or if your team is really good at nerfing enemies with things like the frightened condition, sickened condition, or even the drained condition, which also reduces an enemy's fort DCs. And considering this is weakness damage and not spirit damage, this doesn't have some of the same problems that Vindicator's Mark does, meaning it can work on things even like constructs, which is really handy. So I would say Vindicator's Judgment is worth a feat pickup. If your whole thing is adding extra spell effects onto like a boss, I would mostly use this on a boss specifically, or on a high priority enemy target that you want to get burst down as quickly as possible. But honestly, you're probably just going to be using Vindicator's Mark just multiple times in a combat, which, does make sense. So there's a place for it, of course. I think it's good. I probably wouldn't pick it up until level 12, which is ironic considering what I was talking about Interrogate before. But yeah, overall, not a bad feat. And finally, we have Call the Hunt. This is a feat we can pick up at level 12. It's a singular action. And this does require that we're currently hunting a target. We're a ranger, that's what we do anyway. And the real interesting thing about this one is as long as you and one of your allies are within reach of an enemy, that enemy is considered off guard to all melee attacks. So you don't need to be flanking. As long as you and one of your allies are currently ganging up on an enemy, both of your attacks are considered to be, or the enemy is considered to be off guard. But not only that, any melee strikes makes the enemy off guard. So if you have an ally with reach who's not necessarily flanking either, also really good. And technically, the enemy is off guard to more than just our allies. Even non-allies will be doing more damage because all it requires is that you're, essentially adjacent to this enemy with one of your allies, and then all melee attacks are consider the enemy off guard. So potentially really bad. This really harkens back to one of the major features of Inquisitor back in first edition, which were their teamwork feats. They had a lot of teamwork feats, though their thing was that you could use teamwork feats without the ally having the teamwork feat. And this isn't quite in the same vein, but I do appreciate that this is a bit of that, a callback to how Inquisitor was. And if we're sanctified, us and our allies' unarmed attacks or weapon attacks against this enemy benefit from this sanctification. So we become a really cool, badass demon slaying team as long as we're working with our teammates against these evils. It's really cool. So the Vindicator is really cool. I like it. I think this is a very interesting take on a spellcasting ranger, because spellcasting ranger has been something that's been kind of tooled around a lot, not just in Pathfinder, but also in like D&D 5e. And I haven't really seen it done overly well, but this I do like. Sure, you're not a full spellcaster. Sure, you're not using spell slots. And sure, you only get so many focus points, and Vindicator's Mark is a very tempting one to use. But there are so many really, really good domain spells. And by the way, Divine Mysteries is coming out with more domain spells. So, I would subscribe to the channel just so you could see what new spells we could add to our Vindicators here. I really like this take. It doesn't usurp the position of any of the spellcasters, still protects their niches, but it does give the Rangers some very interesting things to do, especially with some of the domain spells, focus spells, which I think are really, really good. So yeah, that is the Vindicator. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. And in fact, I know many content creators out there have been doing great work, especially with me being sick for the last 5 days or so. They've made a lot of great videos, so go watch their videos. Leave likes on those too. My goal is to make as many people interested in tabletop as possible, and that's only really going to happen if we get the algorithm on our side, especially here on YouTube. The more people we get exposed to tabletop and the cool things we get to do, the better tabletop is going to become. So, that being said, leave a like on this video or any other videos you like. Anyway, thank you all for your time. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.